Okay, this is Chapter 22, The Ordeal of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. It's the last chapter of Period 5 and the last chapter for the holiday break, so let's get started. A few key points, as always. First of all, Reconstruction was a bit more mild than it may have been, and there were several approaches to Reconstruction that existed throughout the period of Reconstruction, and to some extent they did contradict one another. Ultimately, legal protection was extended to the freedmen through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and collectively we just call these the Reconstruction Amendments. So obviously, Reconstruction is a complicated bit. You need to have a genuine peace in order for the Union to survive, and so that's not exactly easy to do. Add to this the complication that comes with Andrew Johnson being president. He's an interesting character to say the least. You can see here that by 1868 he eventually pardoned all of these Confederate leaders, as the pageant refers to it as sort of a Christmas present. But Confederates that were pardoned still felt that their cause was just. They didn't really see they had done anything wrong. The South had, however, been radically changed. The agricultural system was fragmented, social order was greatly impacted as well, and so that all has to be dealt with. And here is Andrew Johnson, the self-made man, the tailor president. Emancipation does take effect unevenly in different parts of the conquered Confederacy. Some slaves resisted liberating Union armies due to their loyalty to their former masters. Others were freed only to be re-enslaved after Northern troops left the region. The church will become the focus of black community life in the years following emancipation. Black churches will be formed, and black ministers will be hired to preach in those churches. Education will come to be valued very highly, especially literacy. Blacks could now learn to read and write. Many did leave the South, however, and the exodusters, as are mentioned in the book, did flee en masse to Kansas. And you can imagine why. This map, I do believe, is from the previous chapter, and you can see how they're referring to the Emancipation Proclamation as freeing slaves in theory in the southern states, or the states that were in rebellion. And here you can see where a lot of folks actually did go to. You can see they did go to all regions of the country outside of the South. And based on this map here, you can see sort of what state they originated from and migratory patterns. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is created as sort of an early form of welfare to provide several things to people, including clothing, medical care, food, and education. Education is the area of greatest success by the Freedmen's Bureau. Notice that it did apply to both freedmen and white refugees. Oliver O. Howard led the Bureau, and the Bureau itself is kind of controversial. We'll talk more about that down the road here. It expired in 1872. President Johnson fought this repeatedly, as you can see here. And here is General Howard, for whom Howard University was named. Now you can see cartoons like this showing the Freedmen's Bureau protecting blacks from mobs of angry, resentful whites, and that is in fact true. But again, as I said, the greatest area of growth and success for the Freedmen's Bureau was in education. And here's a Freedmen's school. I believe this is from North Carolina. One of the problems that did arise with black schools in the South was that there was few black teachers that were qualified, at least not enough to fit the demand. The book also mentions that within one school there was 4 generations of one family in the same schoolroom learning how to read and write. And so in April of 1865, Lincoln was shot and killed at Ford's Theater by the Southerner John Wilkes Booth. Johnson, of course, then takes over as president. Here's an often seen image of that event. And here is a marker of where John Wilkes Booth was killed in Virginia. I actually was at UVA at a seminar and on a field trip, and the bus pulled over on the highway. We all got out. It's a bunch of teachers and myself, and went into the woods about 40 yards or so, and there was this marker. As you can see, people still do pay homage to this assassin. Okay, so Johnson is an interesting character. He is a self-made man, and he had no real formal schooling to speak of. He was apprenticed as a tailor, and actually was a tailor, but unfortunately the nickname was used in kind of a negative way, I think. He is put on the ticket in 1864 to drum up some support from the pro-Southern elements and the war Democrats, but Johnson himself is a strong supporter of states' rights and of the Constitution. In that regard, he's sort of at odds with, I suppose, a strong federal government. He's also been labeled a Southerner who just did not understand the North, and a Democrat who had not been accepted by the Republicans. So prior to Lincoln's death, and prior to the end of the Civil War for that matter, he issued his 10% Reconstruction Plan. And what that said was that when 10% of the voters that voted in the 1860 election swore an oath of allegiance to the Union, then, and also agreed to abide by emancipation, then they could go ahead and create a formal state government, which would eventually be reaccepted into the Union. So this is pretty lenient, and in fact, Lincoln was criticized for this. Congress was not very happy, and they responded with the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. It required that 50% of a state's voters within that election of 1860 take the oath of allegiance, and demanded stronger safeguards for emancipation. Now, President Lincoln refused to sign this bill. That's called pocket vetoing it, and so essentially he waited for Congress to go out of session. Now, this disagreement between the president and Congress revealed differences in the Republicans, and the fact that there were two factions within the party. There's the majority that agreed with Lincoln and believed that the seceded states should be restored to the Union quickly, and then there was this radical minority that existed that felt that the planter class should be punished, and that the newly emancipated blacks needed to be protected by a stronger sense of federal power. President Johnson added to this after Lincoln's death with his own Reconstruction Plan in May of 1865, and it called for special state conventions which were required to repeal the decrees of secession and repudiate all Confederate debts, as well as ratify the 13th Amendment, the amendment which abolished slavery. And at that point, states that agreed to these concessions could be readmitted to the Okay, so throughout the South, there are local laws being passed that are trying to strike down all the gains made by the victory of the Civil War. And these black codes essentially make it a crime to be black. They're designed to restrict the new freedom of the former slaves, and they are designed to ensure that a stable and subservient labor force will continue to exist. And what emerges is this system of sharecropping. And so a freedman who basically has very little or no personal private property after the war, needs land, needs tools, needs seed, and everything else. And so he's going to rent that potentially from his former master. And typically the payment that he would promise at the end of the growing season would be half of his crop. It's going to be a share of his crop, but it was very often half of his crop. Now, what happens as a result of this is a system of perpetual debt. And there's a variety of reasons that this could happen. Keep in mind, if you're growing one single cash crop, that your livelihood is tied to the price of that cash crop. And as you know, there was a panic that occurs in 1873, and so prices go down. But also you have to realize that this group of freedmen is, I'll say, a semi-illiterate group, and it's very possible for these landowners to take advantage of them and perhaps have them sign a contract that is unfair, or even lie to them as to the value of their crops. There's also harsh penalties for folks who jumped on their labor contracts, as many of these people could not. Eventually, they just couldn't pay their debt, and they'd fall farther and farther in the debt, so they would try to flee and leave to some other location, and there's penalties that resulted from that. This is a diagram that actually comes from a different textbook, but it sort of explains the ideas that I have discussed already. So by December of 1865, Southern states represented themselves in Congress with former Confederate generals and colonels, the same folks who were involved probably before the war. And there is an ideological reason behind this, of course. There's opposition to Northern goals and the Northern agenda, but there's also a practical reason. There's few, I suppose, experienced statesmen in the South who do not share their Southern sentiments, so that makes sense to me. But Republicans are pretty upset about this, and they're also upset about the fact that the South would actually have more power in government now that the 3/5 clause will be removed. President Johnson announced on December 6 of 1865 that the Union was now restored. And again, Republicans are furious. So in early 1866, Johnson begins to have direct conflict with the Congress, and he does this with his veto of several congressional attempts at securing the rights of freedmen, and in fact, sort of reshaping the whole point of the Union here. The first bit in February of 1866 is a veto for a bill which would have extended the Freedmen's Bureau. This is later passed over the veto. Congress then passed the Civil Rights Bill in March, and this would have given citizenship to African Americans and also would attack the black codes, as you can see. And again, this happens over a presidential veto. Now, fearing that Southerners might someday repeal the civil rights law, Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1866. And before we talk about that, I did find a little chart here which shows some of the black codes that we're talking about in the previous slide and now. Curfew codes, codes against vagrancy. A freedman who didn't work could be fined, whipped, or sold for a year's labor. Labor contracts, which required you to sign on for a year, and if you broke that contract, you would lose your wages altogether. And you can see other examples here: women's rights limits and land restrictions as well, just to name a few. Now, the 14th Amendment contains several components. Basically, it defined citizenship and guaranteed citizenship to all who were born in this country, and also equal protection of the laws. But in addition to that, you can see that it also reduced proportionally the representation of a state in Congress and in the Electoral College if that state denied blacks the right to vote. It disqualified from federal and state offices former Confederates who, as federal office holders, had once sworn to support the Constitution of the U.S. It also guaranteed the federal debt while the Union assumed all Confederate debts. Now, with the ability to overrule a presidential veto, Congress began to develop the dominant role in controlling the government and Reconstruction. And all Republicans agreed that no state should be welcomed back into the Union without ratifying the 14th Amendment. So by 1868, it's ratified by all states. So in June of 1866, the 14th Amendment passed the House and the Senate, and of course it had to go on to the states to be ratified. Now, also in 1866, in anticipation of this congressional election, which Johnson knew was going to be very important, he went on tour giving speeches denouncing the radical Republicans in Congress and their agenda. Despite this, over two-thirds of the ballots cast in the congressional election of 1866 went to the Republicans. Okay, so the Republican Party, again, is divided. There is this minority group called the Radical Republicans, led by Charles Sumner in the Senate, who has recovered from his caning, as well as Thaddeus Stevens in the House. Both fought for black freedom and racial equality. There's a more moderate Republican group, the majority of Republicans, that preferred policies that restrain the states from cutting citizens' rights, rather than policies that directly involve the federal government in individual lives. And so this is sort of that extension of legal protection that I talked about earlier in the presentation. And in some ways, this is a modern conservative approach. Both groups, however, believe that the freedmen needed the right to vote, and eventually we'll see a constitutional amendment, the 15th, which will guarantee and protect that. There is Sumner on the left and Thaddeus Stevens on the right. Apparently that's a really bad wig. I didn't know that. So in March of 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, and it divided the South into 5 military districts, each of which was commanded by a Union general and policed by Union soldiers. It also required that the states wishing to be readmitted to the Union ratify the 14th Amendment, and that states' constitutions allow former adult male slaves to vote. Now, the modern Republican goal was to create voters in the South that would vote those states back into the Union and thus free the federal government from direct responsibility for the protection of black rights. Now, a constitutional amendment was favored by many to protect those voting rights. And in fact, the 15th Amendment would be passed by Congress in 1869, and it granted black men the right to vote. Now, until 1877, when the federal troops are removed from the South, military Reconstruction, as it's sometimes called, took control of certain functions of the president, and it set up a military rule, martial law in the South. And here are those districts, as you can see. And so obviously women are not included in the 15th Amendment. In fact, there's no mention of gender or sex in terms of denying voting rights. And a lot of folks really had some pretty big issues with this, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, you can see here. Keep in mind, they actively campaigned for the cause of abolition prior to the Civil War and felt that this was the perfect time to include women in this goal of suffrage as well. So the 15th Amendment did increase political organization amongst the freedmen, and the Union League is a great example of this. Originally, it was a pro-union organization, but it became a network of political clubs that educated members and campaigned for the Republican candidates. It built black churches and schools. It represented black grievances before local employers and governments. And also recruited militias to protect black communities from disgruntled whites. From 1868 to 1876, blacks began to hold major offices in government, including these two men here, Senator Blanche Bruce from Mississippi and Hiram Revels from Mississippi. Also, keep in mind that was the home state of the former president of the Confederate States of the Union, Jefferson Davis. So there are other Southern Republicans that warrant some discussion, and I put them in quotations because you could suggest that they're not true Republicans, but in fact they're out for personal gain. There are the Scalawags. They would have been Southern Democrats who, prior to the war, who flipped parties and now support the Republican cause. And then Carpetbaggers, who would have been Northerners who transplanted themselves to the South, packed up all their possessions into a carpet bag, as seen here in this political cartoon from the day. This, by the way, is a carpet bag, and apparently it was fashionable at one point. You can find them in local antique shops around here. Usually they stink to high heaven and are full of dust. Okay, there are several groups that oppose this Republican agenda for civil rights. They are anti-black, anti-Northern. They really are a voice for the pre-war South. The Ku Klux Klan might be the most well-known of these groups. The Invisible Empire of the South was founded, in Tennessee of 1866, and they used violence and intimidation to forward their goals. Now, the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 were passed directly in response to them, and this enabled federal troops to stop the atrocities of the Ku Klux Klan. Here's a cartoon showing the lynching, a very commonly used method by the Ku Klux Klan of a scalawag and a carpetbagger, as you can see here. I know he's a carpetbagger because he's holding one. It says Ohio on that. And here's a pretty well-known cartoon which also shows sort of the goals of these groups and the methods they use. You can see the words "worse than slavery" held above the head with this skull of this family, and sort of they're being kept down in this lower standing. And you can see above that the title, perhaps, of the Union as it was. So in 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, and it required the president to secure the consent of the Senate before he could remove any of his cabinet members once they had been already approved by the Senate. And the purpose of this was to keep Edwin M. Stanton into the cabinet. Now, he is a holdover from the Lincoln administration, but he came to be a spy for the Republican Party as well. So Johnson dismisses him in 1868, and the House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors. Here's an image of the ticket you could have bought to go see this. Apparently, it was the biggest show of 1868. Now, the House of Representatives will prosecute the president as they voted to have him impeached, and the Senate will preside sort of as the jury, and they do not remove him from office. Now, Johnson argues that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional and that he intentionally violated that to challenge the act and bring it before the Supreme Court. Ultimately, though, the Senate voted the president not guilty by a margin of one vote. They needed 2/3 of the Senate to vote in favor to remove Johnson. But there was a real fear of creating sort of a bad precedent of abusing the checks and balances system. Also, people didn't like Benjamin Wade, and he would have been the replacement as president pro tempore of the Senate. He would have been the replacement for Johnson because, again, Johnson didn't have a vice president. He only took office following Lincoln's assassination. Specifically, they didn't like his economic policies. Okay, changing gears just a little bit here. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward, under the Johnson administration, did sign a treaty with Russia, which gave Alaska to the U.S. for about $7.2 million. Apparently, Russia thought that this territory was worth very little. They felt that they had harvested all of the fur out of it, and I guess they didn't know about the resources that were there. They also wanted to strengthen their barrier against their traditional enemy in Britain. Now, the textbook tells us that Americans felt an obligation to buy this, that if they turned it down, it would kind of be bad play against Russia. But it turns out that it was quite profitable for the U.S., despite the fact that Seward's Folly and the Polar Bear Garden were all names that were thrown around by the public for it. Here is archival footage of the polar bears there. Wow, on, lighten up. It's a holiday season. And as I said just a minute ago, there's plenty of resources you can see here: oil, natural gas, coal, all in Alaska, as well as, of course, gold and iron and a bit of tin. Well done, Seward. So, just to wrap things up here, many white Southerners felt that Reconstruction was in fact more painful than the war itself, as it sort of forced this Northern Republican agenda on Southern states. During Reconstruction, the Republican Party wanted to extend legal protection to the freed slaves, and it did that through 3 constitutional amendments. Also, despite good intentions by the Republicans, Reconstruction did not really change the way that the South treated or viewed blacks. It sort of just ended in 1877 due to waning support. And the Compromise of 1877 didn't really finish or is not completed. And it's obviously something that it extends into the 20th and perhaps even 21st century. That's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Again, this is the end of Period 5. I'm very proud of all of you for making it this far, this fast. Wish you a happy holiday season, and I'll see you in class.